Okay, so the next challenge, gathering and aggregating the data. Well, again, I think, one of the things we talked about earlier in the presentation is it is a diverse set of data. And I think that's an understatement, as you'll see. We must collect data from all parts of the process, right? If you skip one, you've created a gap, right? And then we have to automate this data collection. I think this goes back to that the position that we take at OpsMx. We can no longer live in the stop and analyze paradigm. We have to be in the continuous evaluation paradigm of data and risk as it relates to the software delivery lifecycle. And so that automation of data collection must be there. We can no longer live in a spreadsheet world. Now, I thought this was interesting because it gives you a sense. It's, well, by the way, those of you that unlike me that passed high school chemistry, well, I have an appreciation for this. I mean, look, guys, the point here is that there are a lot of tools and a lot of unique places to collect data from. And you can no longer afford to say, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go check the static code analysis, or, maybe you've got some automation there, but I'm going to, for the parts that are variable, like vulnerabilities, like I can't stop and analyze each step along the way. I have to have the ability to collect data from each and every one of these tools. Each and every one of these tools represents, a risk evaluation, right? Like, hey, what are the situation with my vulnerabilities? What is the situation with the quality of code that was written? What is the situation with how the artifacts are being managed? Did the dependencies that I'm bringing in come from an approved or known repo? Am I pulling code in from someplace that's unknown to my organization? So all of these things are there, and they have their own special, sort of measure of risk, but that data needs to be pulled in to be comprehensive. This represents a real challenge in constructing something like this, because you have to be able to leverage either the APIs or some other form of bringing data in these tools. And for the customers we talk to, it becomes a real daunting challenge to do this on your own, right? And I think that's something that we've taken from the marketplace. And so that's one part of this, is that, just so many data sources. And
Well, I
then,
think I was,
yeah.
I was wondering there about, because I think I know that the customers I've talked to will talk about having, 10, 12, 15 different tools that
Mm-hmm,
people have to log into
mm-hmm.
to kind of get this complete picture we want to build. But I think the underlying value there is that all the data that you need is actually present in these tools. Right.
Yes.
And so I think
Yes.
what in many cases, we're not dealing with a go get data problem. We're dealing with a assemble data problem, right?
Yes,
You,
that's
you,
a
you've
great
got,
point,
you've
David.
got the information already, right?
Yep, yep, yep. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it's really about, how do I bring all that together? How do I bring it all
Yeah.
together to form, sort of a meaningful, and then correlate it, by the way, right? So there's a correlation aspect of this as well, to the individual application or to the individual subservice of that application, right? So, no, that's a great point, David. I think that's really, I think that's probably the meat of the challenge, right? That's where
Mhm.
the heart of the challenge lies, right? Is bringing that all together into a single spot. Um, so the other piece of this, obviously, is you have to automate this, right? So everything we talked about so far, as it relates to velocity and scale and our ability to go ahead and actually bring this data on board and analyze that data, it has to be met with automation, right? So the automation of that data collection, bringing it all into sort of a single source of truth, right? Which would be an SDLC data store, right? Is, again, something that is another large challenge, right? I mean, you need to make sure that that data is coming through. It's automated. It doesn't skip a beat. For every single thing that happens while that pipeline is moving through, as it's going from dev to staging to production, you need to make sure you're constantly collecting this information and then refreshing the data, that a system that you're using to formulate this security posture overview is constantly recalculating that to understand sort of where the risks are. And also, if there is a risk that just goes beyond the parameters that you've set, right? So I cannot, based on my industry or based on my customers or contractual obligations, I cannot deploy software that has these security holes or these security gaps. So, making sure that you're collecting that data and then resynthesizing it or analyzing it throughout the process is critical to this part of the problem. And again, it represents a challenge to those that are looking to build this out because they find themselves in a spot where they've got to build a system to ultimately help them do this. David, any thoughts on this? I was going to move on, but I wanted to just stop and check with
Actually,
you.
no, I have a question that came in, Bob. That was someone was
Yeah.
asking about the if there's any particular challenges when you about integrating kind of a mix of cloud-based tools and legacy tools, right? Because even some of the logos you show here, some of those have been
Mhm.
around a long time, some of those are next-gen tools, but anything you see there in terms of putting things together.
No, and I think well that's also part of the challenge, guys, right? And for us, it's not, right? And I think, because we've got the experience with both sides of that equation. But I could see where if you're trying to do this on your own, where this could be a challenge, right? Because you've got again, some of the tooling from say like AWS, where they've got a bunch of products that do some of this work, right? But then you've got, Jenkins and JFrog. Those are things that you just happen to have used and you don't want to change tools. I think, the challenge here is you need to be able to sort of span that entire tool chain or that entire tool set. And I think, we've have seen customers that have had some struggles there. And that's why I think, they look outside of their organization to build something like this.
Yeah. Well, I think your comment there, Bob, about the tools you've already got is really critical, and it goes back to the polling result that we had at the beginning about
Hmm.
keeping balancing velocity of deployments and security. Because I think if you as long as development teams get to keep using the tools that they've been using in the way that they've been using them,
Hmm.
their sense is that everything keeps moving fast at the same speed, right? So I think that's really key when you try and introduce changes in that tooling environment or additional steps in the tooling environments, and people throw their hands up and say, "Oh, you're slowing me down. I don't have time for this. I can't make this transition. I got a release to get out." And so I think that this kind of way of thinking about it is really helpful there.
Yeah, and I think David, before we move on, I just want to acknowledge you brought up a great point. Um, Operational transparency as it relates to the developer, right? All this has to go on, but one of the things we have to be careful about is we do not want to slow our developers down, right? We don't want to create another process for them. This should be nothing but in a give and take relationship. This should be nothing but take for the developer. They should not have to
Right.
give a thing, right? And so we want to make sure that that happens. And I think that's another pillar of sort of putting a solution like this together. So great call out, David. Thank you for that.